Okay, hello everybody. Let's do our next section of notes here. Today we're just going to focus on different pieces of evidence for evolution. This is all evidence that's been studied over a long period of time since the theory of evolution kind of came forward in the 1800s. And some people might say, well, why don't we talk about the evidence against evolution? And that's because there really isn't much. There are little individual cases where maybe some theories don't really apply to those situations, but if 99.999% of the situations can be explained through the mechanisms of evolution, then those 0.0001% aren't considered as overall pieces of information that we can use. So we're going to go through 4 or 5 different pieces of evolution, and your job is to be able to understand how it shows that things have changed through heritable characteristics have changed over time. All right, this is number 1. Number 1 is a piece of information that we call comparative anatomy. And in comparative anatomy, anatomy is all about the structure of a body. When structural characteristics are shared, this implies a common ancestry. So what does a common ancestry mean? A common ancestry says that you shared an ancestor, but you branched off from one another. So these particular structures that we have up here are called homologous structures. Homologous structures. And homologous structures are structures that have the same arrangement, but they have different functions. And in this case, let's refer up here to what we call the pentadactyl limb. So penta meaning 5, dactyl refers to like fingers or digits, and limb refers to the arm. And so when you take a look at almost all of these things here, let's start with the human. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 digits. We have a cat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 digits. We have a bat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 digits. And we have a whale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 digits. Now, all of these structures are pretty similar. I left off the horse and bird for a reason. And this picture is really great because things are color-coded. But all of these organisms have a humerus up top here. All of these organisms then have 2 bones right down here. Right, times 2. Down here, there's 2 of these here. There's 2 big ones right here. It's kind of hard to see one of them here, but it's back there. And then another one here. And in fact, most of these also have these brown bones right here. These are the metatarsals, or the carpals actually, since these are hands. And we've got these similar structures, but they're all built a little bit differently, and they all serve a different function. Whales and birds and bats and horses use theirs for motion, whereas cats and humans, well, cats use theirs for motion as well, but also for grabbing and hunting and things like that. We use ours for grasping. We don't really use our arms for motion. And don't say, well, I crawl on my arms. You don't crawl on your arms all the time. Stop it. So because there's some similarities in the structures, it means we did come from a similar ancestor. But because they have different functions, it means that am I still on green? I'm still on green. Okay. Because they have a different function, it means that this is an adaptation to use a specific unoccupied niche. Now, a niche is like a role or a job. And these particular adaptations are there because these organisms were more successful in these specific environments because of these changes. You know, the bat evolved their adaptation of these really long phalanges. These are like fingers with skin that's stretched between them so that it can fly. You know, the whale has these really long digits here but short digits here to create a nice, wide, long, powerful, moving flipper. The horse's digits all fuse together to form a nice, rigid structure that can be walked on, and walked on a lot. And so these structures have evolved so that these organisms can be successful in a new environment. Now, you can't choose to evolve as a thing, though. I say that these structures evolved so that they could be successful, but these specific things, you don't choose to evolve. These changes happened, and it caused these things to be more successful in their new environment. Okay, let's move on to number 2, and we are going to talk about the fossil record. Now, fossils don't have to be bones. Fossils can also be things like footprints. Footprints don't contain bones. They could be imprints left behind of something. I'll show you one of those in just a second. But the important thing about fossils is that the fossil record, which includes all of this stuff that we found and haven't found yet, reveals features of ancestors to compare with living descendants. Okay, so things like bones are really awesome because they provide us with direct evidence of things. But footprints and imprints of things, and they also do find fossilized feces a whole lot. Maybe they might find like a tooth mark on a bone or something like that. These are all really cool pieces of information, but this isn't considered to be direct evidence because it's not the bones that you can compare things with, but this is called indirect evidence. Okay, so we've got our fossil record, and one of the cool things about fossils is that they're in rock. And one of the things we know about rock is that the newer rock is always on the top. So when we have a fossil down deep, and then 10 feet above that we find another fossil, we can infer that the one on top is newer than the other one, and maybe even they're related to each other, for one reason or another. But that's an important rule to know about fossils, and that is that lower rocks, when we find them in lower rocks, it equals older than the ones around it. But these rocks can also be dated. Rocks can be dated to figure out how absolutely old they are. And so this is called relative dating, because what you're saying is this is older than this, and because it's on top. This is what's called absolute dating. And that absolute dating is when we say this is 23 million years old, exactly. Things like that. All right, let's bring up a couple pictures here, show you a couple really neat things about fossils. Let's start with this one right here. This is a fossil of a dinosaur called Archaeopteryx. It's one of my favorite fossils. Archaeopteryx was interesting because it has all of these really characteristic dinosaur things. like for example, like these clawed hands, this longer snout and things like that. But one of the most interesting things about this are these imprints right here, which show feathers. This is one of the first appearances in our fossil record of a feathered dinosaur, which is really, really, really neat. And this is an example of a kind of fossil called a transitional fossil. And transitional fossils are really cool because, we may find an older dinosaur, we'll say dinosaur A, and then we'll know that something exists way up here in the future, living thing E, maybe it's a chicken or something like that. Archaeopteryx fills in that gap a little bit, and it shows the transition from one thing to another thing to another thing. Now, this might be fossil B, this might be C, this might be D. We're not exactly sure because we're still digging fossils up and we're still finding fossils and things like that. Another really cool example of the fossil record here. That's not the right picture at all. How do I get rid of that? Okay, here we go. Let's find this. Here it is. Okay. This is another really cool story that I learned about a while ago, and this is the evolution of whales. It's the evolution of whales. Let's zoom in on this guy a little bit here. Whales have some things in common with hippos, and so scientists kind of always knew that hippos were sort of related to whales in some way. And through a lot of digging, they were finding these fossils just independent of one another. And then over time, they were able to sort of piece together the transition of things. And so whales are actually related to an ancient ancestor of wolves as well. And then we know that because there's this thick bony wall around the middle ear that is only found in modern day wolves, which means that wolves and whales share a common ancestor. It doesn't mean that they are related to one another. It means that one of their relatives is the same. All right, long time ago. Anyway, so scientists kept digging up these fossils. They found one they called Indohyus, Pecocetus, Ambulocetus, Cuchicetus, Rhodocetus, Dorodon, Odontocetus, Mysticetus. They kept finding these fossils, and by looking at similar structures and trying to figure out where things changed from one place to another, they were able to sort of piece together this thing. They were able to see that the legs were getting shorter. One of the cool things is that they're able to see like that nose shifting from the very front of the nostrils. How can the nose shift from the front of the nostrils? The nose are the nostrils. Okay. But the nostrils on the nose shift from the very front of the face to being on the top of the skull, like a blowhole that we know. And there's another piece of whale evolution that we'll get into a little bit later. But these fossils that show us these transitional forms are really, really, really cool. One last piece of information about transitional forms. This is a really neat table that shows a whole bunch of characteristics of the change from what we think is the first human ancestor, a species called Australopithecus. Where was this found? Not Australia. It was found in Africa. Specifically, this is Australopithecus afarensis. Notice how I lowercased the second word, uppercase the first word, and just to do a real proper scientific name, I'm going to underline that whole thing too. This was the first thing that stopped showing chimpanzee or ape-like characteristics and started to have some human characteristics. And over time, lots of fossils have been dug up to try to fill in these transitional gaps. And so one of the things that we've seen is a downward-facing foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is one of the holes in the bottom of our skull, and it went from facing a little bit towards the back to actually facing downward, which is an indicator that we were bipedal or standing upright and not walking on our hands. The curvature of the spine became S-shaped. The leg became longer than the arm as far as ratios go. Bigger heel bone. A shift in our gluteal muscles. Those are the butt muscles. So that means there was something changing about how the muscles were going into the hip. And all of these changes that we have right here have been identified through the use of transitional fossils. I'm about to start a book that I'm really excited to read about the evolution of the human form and what all of the evidence is that leads up to this. This is a big piece of contention with the story of evolution because a lot of people, it's some sort of weird affront to them to have shared a common ancestor with an ape. I think it's a real elegant story that shows how things can change and adapt, and I take no offense to it, but yes, I guess I just don't see that point. Let's go to number 3, selective breeding. Selective breeding is evidence for evolution as well, because selective breeding shows that certain characteristics can be selected as being the best characteristics, and as a result, we get new forms. You know this because of dogs. What did the first dog look like? I'll tell you what it didn't look like, as a pug. And so what did it look like? Probably looked a little bit kind of wolfy. Some people suspect that it actually looked a little more like not a greyhound, but more of like a normal dog version of a greyhound is another thought process. But take a look sometime at what pit bulls used to look like 100 years ago versus nowadays. And that's evidence that things can change over time. Take a look at what pugs looked like 100 years ago compared to nowadays. That's evidence that things can change over time. And so selective breeding isn't natural selection because we make those choices. Selective breeding is a kind of what we call artificial selection. In an artificial selection, you take something, here's our dog, it's an extraordinary long-necked dog, and this dog has lots of offspring. And some of those offspring have characteristics that are unique to them, and others have characteristics what they share with all of their brothers and sisters. And let's say this one has a slightly bigger head. In selective breeding, if a breeder was like, this giant-headed dog is way cuter than other dogs, I'm going to take this dog and make this dog have a lot of dogs. And now these puppies a lot of times are born with bigger heads because you've increased those odds. So let's draw a bunch of puppies with bigger heads here, and maybe one didn't come out with a bigger head. And now our breeder may say, I like your head right here. I'm going to breed you a bunch now. Until eventually we get this dog that can't even lift its head up. Kind of like how we've bred pugs so that they all have respiratory problems. Anyway, this is artificial breeding, and this is evidence of evolution because we have shown through artificial breeding that by selecting certain characteristics, you can change a species. This has happened in horse breeding. People have bred horses to be the fastest, the strongest, the whatevereth. Cows. This has happened in cows. We breed cows to have certain kinds of milk, to have certain colors, to have certain characteristics. This has happened with dogs, with cats, with any animal that you can think of that's domesticated. This has happened with, because people have said, I like that characteristic and that's what I want more of. One other one that's really interesting is a bunch of plants. Farmers do this too. If you were to look at ancient bananas from 200 or 300 years ago, you could not eat them. You can't eat them. It's only through the selective breeding by farmers that we have bananas that we can actually eat. But there's this plant called called wild mustard. And people took different characteristics of that plant that they really liked, and they would pick those plants and take the seeds for those plants and mix them with other plants that had those characteristics, and so on and so forth. And we now have 6 different plants that we have gotten by just selectively breeding one wild mustard plant. People selected giant flowering buds and stems, and we have broccoli. The flower buds, if just focusing on the flower buds, by selecting always the ones that were the biggest and the biggest and the biggest and the biggest, and keep breeding those, we ended up with cauliflower. Most of you probably don't know what kohlrabi is, but you probably know these other things. But there's these leaf buds that grow on the end of little branches on this, and people kept selecting the plants that made the biggest ones and the biggest ones and the biggest ones until eventually we end up with cabbage. The biggest leaves for kale, the biggest lateral leaf buds. Lateral means off to the side. If you've ever seen an actual twig of Brussels sprouts, you'll know what I'm talking about. Okay, so we just have two more that'll be really quick here. Two more pieces of evidence for evolution. Number 4 are vestigial structures. Vestigial means leftover. And I'm going to go back to whales for this one. And I'm going to show you this fossil of a whale. This is a big old blue whale here. And I want you to notice this right back here. These are little, tiny, leftover, useless leg bones that are still in the genome for whales. This is a piece of evidence for evolution. It's a piece of evidence that shows that whales evolved from something that had legs. Now, those legs didn't get smaller because the whales didn't use them. That would be kind of ridiculous. You can't just get real muscular and then have a totally buff baby. But what happened is that the whales with the smaller legs were more successful and able to move around better. I mean, take a look. Ambulocetus over here and Cuchacetus and Rhodocetus over here all had pretty good legs, and it's probably because these animals lived close to the shore, and so they were able to move along really quickly along a riverbed or a shoreline or something like that to hunt. But if there was increased competition there, then the things with smaller legs could actually swim out a little farther and get fish where maybe there wasn't as much competition, in which case the smaller leg things were better able to survive. And then it just keeps going and going and going and going until you get this other thing. So vestigial structures are sort of functionless, reduced remnants of things that were once present. Think about in humans, we have an appendix because our ancestors had a larger organ down there that could help to digest plants. And it became a successful characteristic to not have a very big one, maybe because our diet switched to meats. And so the individuals that were born with, maybe larger stomachs to digest the meat and a smaller one of that were better survived. Remember, you can't just not use something and it shrinks away and then you pass that on to your kids. This has to be a heritable characteristic. We also have little muscles in our ears that aren't attached to anything and can't be used. Why are they there? Because our ancestors had muscles in their ears. And it became more successful for us to not have those muscles. We didn't choose to make those things go away. And our last piece of evidence, and there's a lot more pieces of evidence for evolution, but our last piece of evidence is going to be embryology. Embryology. If we take a look at a bunch of embryos over here, now don't look at the bottom, don't look at the names of these organisms, but if you were to take a look just at this top row right here, and if I was to ask you which one is us, you'd be really hard-pressed to try to figure that out. They look almost exactly the same. In fact, we can see all of these things have tails. By looking at embryos, we can say, well, if embryos have tails, maybe our ancestors had tails and we are related to one another. And if we get up to here, you could probably get rid of a couple things and say, well, these couple aren't human. But down here, in the mammal end of things, they look a lot alike. A lot alike. And so embryology shows how maybe we shared a common evolutionary path with other things. And so These are all these 5 things here are pieces of evidence for evolution. Today we're just going to do some notes. Tomorrow we'll do some application about this. And the key here is when you list one of these things, number one, you should be able to name it as a piece of evidence for evolution. Number one, the next thing you have to think of is how does it show ancestry? Or how does it show change over time? These are the 2 big questions to think about. And that's it for today. Have a great one.